this era of Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun fil madhhab, now, did they leave behind a large amount of fatawa, or did they leave behind books of fiqh? What was the type of things that left behind?
These absolute Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun, what they did is they left behind both fatawa
Mm-hmm.
and curricula.
All right.
Now the era of the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun runs from 11 AH all the way into 241 Hijri.
Subhanallah.
Okay. Now the methodology of Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun runs from 241 to 652.
Mm-hmm.
So in this era, the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun are laying down the fatawa that have been given in the past, answering new queries that had not been discussed before, and also laying down books. Now, an important thing that happened during this time is because people were studying the Musnad and building the Musnad on top as their methodology in building, as people's knowledge started to depreciate,
Mm-hmm.
people didn't have the same capacity to do what they had done before. So what did they do? Well, Imam Abul Qasim al-Khiraqi, who died 334, he is a student of Imam Ahmed's eldest son, Salih al-Baghdadi.
Mm-hmm.
He collected together what's called al-Mukhtasar, which is the very first book in Hanbali fiqh that did not include all the ahadith and evidences. It's just a metan with the rulings. And this was done because of the fact that people's knowledge in that time had started to depreciate. And so it was necessary that they can't just study the Musnad, they can't just study the ahadith as had been done before. People did not have this qualification, but they also didn't have the yearning drive, because now people had what's called a nightlife, they had day labor, they had other things that now occupied them from studying into the religion full time. And that's only going to make sense because not everybody can dedicate themselves to it full time. So this book was done, whereas the Ahlul Rai, they'd already produced those books of fiqh first.
I see. Yeah.
Right, because remember the methodology. They'd already produced books of fiqh and fatwa first. And then their commentaries on hadith came much later.
Right. SubhanAllah.
The collections they produced later. Like, for example, Imam Ahmed produces, al-Musnad, Imam al-Bukhari, al-Jami al-Sahih, Imam Muslim, al-Jami al-Sahih, Imam Abu Dawood, al-Sunan, right? These people, Abu Bakr al-Athram. Abu Bakr al-Athram put to pen the very first book on Nasikh and Mansukh in Hadith as well as Quran. That's the oldest that exists.
MashaAllah.
Right? Now, these type of texts wouldn't be produced by the Ahlul Rai until sometime later. And it's not because they didn't have this knowledge. It's because their emphasis wasn't upon that, because their methodology was different. So it's not we're not, no one's disparaging anyone. It's just the methodology produces different things. And so the methodology of Ahl al-Hadith gave us first a hadith and texts and everything else that built the blueprint. And then when they saw that people had some du'af in their aql and these other things, okay, well, what we're going to do is we produce the blueprint that we can always go back to.
Right.
Now what we're going to give is we're going to start giving you kutub. And so they started giving them kutub. So the Mukhtasar was the first of these kutub, and some 400 commentaries were written upon the Mukhtasar.
So the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Khiraqi.
Yes.
Now, this becomes the Mu'tamad fiqh text.
Yes.
And this covers all of the chapters in organized fashion.
That's correct.
So could you then take us through this phase? So after the students of Imam Ahmad, we have Imam Abul Qasim al-Khiraqi, who established his books. Now, what is the process? How does it go from there with the books and the methodologies of the fiqh of the Hanabila?
Okay, so after this time, so the Hanabila are based in Iraq, and then there's a small sept, S-E-P-T, of them that are based in Arabia. Now, something interesting happens. Before I get into the kutub, I want to mention something that's significant. Imam Malik, rahimahullah, wa radiyallahu anhu, after he dies, Well, actually, before this, Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi and others, they go to Andalus.
Right.
And so many of the Maliki scholars and the students of Imam Malik, they empty out of Arabia
Oh, wow. SubhanAllah.
and head into North Africa
Right.
and Andalus. Well, during this time, that delegation of students that had visited Imam Ahmed and others, they kind of pour across Arabia. Because many people want to understand, well, why is it that the Hanbalis and the Malikis are so plethrous in Arabia? What happened? Well, it's for this reason why the Hanabila wound up overtaking the Malikis, because many of the students of Imam Malik emptied out to go to Andalus during this time in North Africa, where they were needed.
SubhanAllah.
Because Imam Abu Amr al-Awza'i, his fatwa and rulings started to fade, and other things began to happen. So the Malikis picked up the responsibility for having qadis and sending out muftis and fuqaha, right? So then this delegation increased in stature and began to grow in bigger numbers, and more people needed to be sent. Imam Ahmed's students sent students that went to them. The very first footsteps into Sham was Abu Qasim al-Khiraqi, who moved from Iraq into Damascus.
Right.
So this was the first of the Hanabila in Sham, and why they got into Arabia. Right. So this is how this happened. So the 400 commentaries that get written on this book, everything is standardized, and other issues that had not been discussed, or where there's sometimes a statement that has a level of ambiguity in it. These commentaries flesh out these ambiguities.
Right.
They explain and discuss these ambiguities, where sometimes there's statements that Imam Ahmed didn't answer because they hadn't happened yet, because Imam Ahmed, rahimahullah, he refused to answer hypothetical questions. So he said, when it happens, look into the matter then.
Right.
There were other issues where there were choices on two areas where there's sometimes what's called al-Zahir. Al-Zahir is where there's a dominant statement, but then there's another statement as well as a second statement, as like a backup, right? So you had to now start to discuss, okay, what's the mu'tamid, what is the dependent upon statement when you have two statements on a matter, because one was dominant and one was another way, right? So you had to also flesh this out during this time. So they referred to the students and the students of the students, like Abu Bakr al-Khalal, rahimahullah, who wrote the big book Al-Jami', which was a collection of fiqh rulings of Imam Ahmed. They referred back to the Masail books of Abdullah, because Abdullah, the son of Imam Ahmed, wrote a book called Kitab al-Masail from his father. Salih wrote a book, which is 3 volumes, called Al-Masail. And then Abu Bakr al-Khalal collected together those rulings and other rulings from the students, right? And then you had Abdul Wahhab, which was another student of students who gathered together some rulings, right? So they referred back to these in fleshing out areas. And then they also looked at Imam Ahmed's methodology, his facial expressions at the time he passed the ruling, other things like this that gave further indication. Because in the first 3 generations, sometimes someone's facial expression or a gesture would tell you what a ruling in question was. And so the madhhab of Imam Ahmed isn't based on just one man, as we discussed. It's between 3 and 10,000 companions. Then you have Imam Ahmed and his students, which are 100. So you go from 3 to 10,000 to 100 or 101. And then you have the madhhab is built upon what Imam Ahmed has said from those, and then what the madhhab has gathered upon as well. So then the rulings that come after that Imam Ahmed did not pronounce upon is what the madhhab then gathered upon. And that's through the commentary books and other kutub that explain these affairs. So there were a series of books that came out after Abu Qasim al-Khiraqi's.
May I ask you something? So this fiqh text of Imam al-Khiraqi, now, does this contain one opinion on the rules, or did it have several opinions on a particular ruling?
It is qawlun wahid. It's one qawl. But the way that it was written, and this was done on purpose, the way that it was written, it also included the zahir and the mu'tamid. So you'd have like 2 qawls, because he wanted to make sure to preserve things as much as he could. And then also within that kitab, Abul Qasim al-Khiraqi also made ijtihad sometimes because he was a mujtahid within his own right. Right. So he also gave rulings within that text where he said, oh, well, what's this statement here? So commentary said, well, here he's made ijtihad when you have two possible rulings. There's a zahir and then there's the al-Marjuh, right? So the preferred opinion, and then there's this. And Abu Qasim al-Khiraqi, he went to this side. So during this time, you started finding in the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun fil madhhab, absolute mujtahids within the madhhab, you also found issues where there was more than one answer. So you had to start having what are called council meetings, which are called majalis, where they would meet together and have ikhtilaf and try to resolve these areas. Now, the areas that were resolved, that's obviously the mu'tamid. The areas that were not were left open to be resolved because, okay, well, this isn't the most important matter right now. That can be left, right? That was left for later generations to deal with because it wasn't pressing. Then you have matters where, okay, this is the mu'tamid, but in the absence of that, or when not having the ability to do that, then you do this because this is a zahir qawl.
So we have now from the companions until Imam Ahmad, this is the era of Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun.
Yes.
And with the students of Imam Ahmad, include Imam al-Khiraqi and those after him, this is the era of Mujtahidun Mutlaqun fil madhhab. Now, until what time does this last?
Okay, this process runs from 241 to 652.
Okay.
Now, one of the most important figures during this time was a big imam by the name of Ibn al-Manni. Now, Ibn al-Manni, he gathered together Abu Futiyan. He gathers together all these different rulings in the school, and he becomes one of the sources, literally marja al-madhhab fi waqtihi. He is like the marja of the madhhab in his time. Although in his era, there are other elders like Shaikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, Muwafaquddin al-Qudama, Shamsuddin Qudama, his nephew, right? There's other people this rank. Now, Imam Muwafaquddin al-Qudama is a student of his and takes from him and gathers all of his available knowledge. Then you have Imam Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, who dies 652. He's not the direct student of Ibn al-Manni, but he's a student of a student of his.
Right.
So they gather together all the available knowledge and they systematize all of that that's been put together into their kutub. So Imam Muwafaquddin Qudama rahimahullah writes a fiqh curriculum. So while he's in Baghdad, he's with Shaykh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, he's with Ibn al-Manni, and so he writes al-Mughni at this time. But then when he gets back, now this is between 17 and 18 years of age, he completes al-Mughni.
The large collection, right?
Yes.
Right.
This is the most famous commentary on al-Khiraqi. It's the most famous commentary. Al-Mughni is the most famous commentary.
How many volumes is it?
It is 10 in most print houses. It's 10. So he gets back. Then he finishes the rest of his curriculum. He writes Al-Umda, which is one slim volume. He writes Al-Muqni', which sometimes is 2 volumes, and other times it's one fist-sized volume. Then his final qawl, his final statement is Al-Kafi. That's his final statement. Then Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, who's just after his era, right? He writes Al-Muharrar fil Fiqh, the clarifier and exemplifier in fiqh, right? Now, those get written. And at that point, Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah, he says in his time, now Imam Rajab, he dies 795. Muwafaquddin al-Qudama dies 620.
Right.
Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah dies 652. He says that it has been the case that since their time, meaning since those kutub were penned, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali says it's been the case that since that time, the madhhab has been upon what the two sheikhs have said. So after the era of Majduddin, the kutub are gathered together, and the madhhab gathers upon the kutub of Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah and Muwafaquddin al-Qudama.
So these are the shaykhain of the madhhab.
That's correct. So when they agree upon something, then that's the mu'tamad, that's the ruling.
All right. So
when they differ, When they differ, you go with Muwafaquddin al-Qudama.
Subhanallah.
Now, if the answer is not in Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, and it's not, and then you look and it's in Muwafaquddin al-Qudama, but you have more than one qawl, like let's say there's something Muqni' and something in the Kafi, you go with the Kafi. Why? Because the Kafi is his final book. Right. So then a methodology develops how to explain their kutub.
Subhanallah.
And so all these commentaries start getting built upon what they've said. So the Muqni' starts developing a commentary literature of itself. The first of which is Shamsuddin ibn Qudama, who died 682 Hijri. He writes Ash-Shafi, which is also known as Ash-Sharh al-Kabir.
Right.
And elders take the Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi, al-Mughni, al-Sharh, they take al-Muqni' and then they take Ash-Shafi and they combine them together. So although it's 4 or 5 books, because there's a Fahris with it, they combine it together into one series. And then they split the page. They create what's called an interlinear. So they split the page. So now you have 4 kutub in one. And also Muwafaquddin al-Qudama, by his time, they alphanumerically coded all the fatwa. So Fatwa 1 is going to do with how many types of water are there. There are this. Fatwa number 200 and something is to do with ibadat, right? So they coded everything. So by this time, everything's been coded. So now you have the commentary literature built on top of the Muharrar and the works of Muwafaquddin al-Qudama, in specifics his Muqni', because his Muqni' he'll give more than one qawl, more than one statement, because there may be issues that are open, or he's made ijtihad, or there's a matter that requires greater clarification. So everything's built up on top of that.
So the books that come after Imam ibn Qudama and after Imam Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, these are books of the era of a new type of Mujtahidun, right? Those
okay, so now we're dealing with the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun. So these are the preferential Mujtahids. And the preferential Mujtahids, now that all the absolute Mujtahids within the madhhab have died off, the Mujtahids left who become dominant, because all these Mujtahids exist at the same time, but they become dominant at different times when one dies out. So the absolute Mujtahids die out, so the absolute Mujtahids within the madhhab become dominant. Absolute Mujtahids within the madhhab die out, the preferential Mujtahids become dominant. So the era of the preferential Mujtahids, they become dominant. And that era runs from 652 to 885. And so all of this commentary literature grows. So for example, you have on the Muqni', you get 4 huge commentaries. Al-Mubdi' Sharh al-Muqni' by Burhanuddin ibn Muflih, and he dies 855. You get Al-Furu' by Shamsuddin ibn Muflih, which is loosely based around those kutub, and it's built on top of a lot of other things. You get Alauddin al-Mardawi, who died 885. His text, Al-Insaf, is dealing with all these issues in the Muqni' and inter-madhhab discussion. So Al-Insaf is intra-madhhab discussions. It's things going on inside the madhhab, and he's able to, through council meetings and other data, to also close the door on issues that at that point had still been open. So a whole bunch of doors get closed, meaning on matters that get settled. So a whole bunch of things got settled in his time. The Mujtahidun Murajjihun, those things get settled. So you have Alauddin al-Mardawi, you have Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, who's also from this era. You have you have Abu Ali al-Ba'ali, who's also this is Alauddin al-Ba'ali, who died 802 Hijri. They start, and all these usul books start to get built as well. So al-Qawa'id gets written by Ibn Rajab. You have the Tahrir being written. You have all these other kutub that start being created at this time, that in order to find the preferred position, which will be the mu'tamad position, they start to explain what's the methodology of how you'll know to do that. How do you do that? So they start to explain, how do you do? Well, okay, listen, when this particular imam pronounces, he's one of the more timid ones, so his voice is pronounced. When you find this statement said, that means it's the more timid. When you find this ruling, that is this, right? So during this time, now, during the era that transferred over from the absolute mujtahids within the madhhab to the preferential mujtahids, a very significant event occurred. And that was the great catastrophe, an-Nakbatul Kubra, which was the destruction of Baghdad. Now, during this time, this catastrophe led to the death of between 1 and 2 million people within a week because of the arrival of the Tatar to Baghdad. And they laid waste to everything they could get their hands on. So a lot of the elders in the school that had been in Iraq, they were killed. They were martyred. But by this time, you have to remember, in the era of absolute mujtahids within the school, in the era of al-Qadir Abu Ja al-Baghdadi, who died 458 Hijri, he'd had Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi. They'd already been sent, and they'd been sent to Palestine. And so Nablus, there'd been mass conversions to Islam in Nablus, and they'd sent Hanbali Qadis there. They'd sent some to Homs, and they'd sent some to Damascus proper, around areas such as Duma or the Ghouta, which is Duma, Dumair, Ruhayba. So this gives you the reasoning of how the madhhab comes into Sham and Palestine proper. So you're looking in the era of al-Qadir Abu Ja al-Baghdadi, who's responsible for this, particularly a lot of the missionary efforts of Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi. Because Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi is extremely important because of his his speaking with a lot of the monks. Because when he first arrived in Philistine, they thought he was a monk. Because his clothes were like theirs, and they thought he was a monk. So they took him in. And he spoke to them about the religion and so forth, and that led to these mass conversions. This is why Nablus converted in huge amounts. In fact, al-Jami' al-Salahi, the Salahi Masjid, used to be a Justinian monastery. And the same thing happened in Ghouta, in specifics in Duma. The Jami' al-Kabir in Duma, that used to be a sun worship temple, and it was converted into a masjid. So this is what started the madhab's onward advance out of Iraq into Sham. We've already discussed Arabia. And so we had Sham, which includes Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. This explains that. In Afghanistan, Salih al-Baghdadi, he had spread, and he had sent qadis there to where they were in Jalalabad, where they were in Kabul, and they were in other areas. And so this led to the expansion of the school in Afghanistan. And that's why you had great scholars like Abu Ismail al-Ansari, the great Afghani Hanbali elder and Sufi. You start producing these type of elders as well. We've gotten to Turbat-e-Jom, which is in Iran. This area, Turbat-e-Jom and Jilan, which is obviously with Shaikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani. His family, although Arabs, they immigrated from there. So there was a footprint which still exists today in Jilan and Turbat-e-Jom in Iran. There are still Qudat there.
And so we still today have Hanbali Qudat in Iran and in Afghanistan as well?
In Afghanistan, when I went on Hajj about 12 years ago, I met some Hanabila from Afghanistan. And they had been in Jalalabad, and they explained to me broken Arabic stroke Pashto, which I'm not fluent in at all. But they were able to explain that there'd been some scholarship that had carried on, say, a few hundred years ago that got there. So it does exist. This scholarship is there. Now, the degree and strenuous nature of it, I don't know. But I met those brothers on Hajj, and because what struck me was their salah was exactly like mine and such. And so I spoke with them, and I just come out of ihram because I was in the days of tashriq. So I'm out of my haram. So I've got black imam, so do they.
MashaAllah.
Clothing is similar. So I thought, well, that's very strange because I know that the general Afghani clothing has a specific look to it. And so I spoke with them very briefly, and that's what I was able to piece together.
MashaAllah. And before I mentioned this, you wanted to say something about the Qudat and the Hanabla of Iran?
Yes, so they're still there today, but they're under a great amount of pressure. It has to be remembered that 1/3 of Iran is still Sunni. And so the pressure that they're under is immense. And so we ask that you pray for our brothers and sisters in Iran, and that inshallah, if possible, to just go visit them.
Yes.
To visit, right now, there's no legal prohibition as far as I know. And I've not heard of any boycotts or any embargo where you can't get there. So if slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can get there, it'd be a good idea to go and visit them, and if knowledge can be taken, to take knowledge from them.
If you don't mind, just going back to the last point you were mentioning on the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun. So in this era, we said that this began in 652 and ran until 885, and we have imams such as Alauddin al-Mardawi, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, and they established Mu'tamad, the Mu'tamad. So,
they established the rules for being able to know the Mu'tamad.
Right, okay.
So when this scholar says this, then we know, that's the Mu'tamad. If this should differ and that should differ, the Mu'tamad is this.
All right.
If you get this and this, that's going to be this. If you find these two books differ, then this. Like that's how I know that when Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah and Muwaffaquddin Qudama, when their kutub both agree, that's how I know that. It's from the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun, because Ibn Rajab mentioned this. And he laid out a whole schemata, which we learned this little ditty that he wrote out about 4 or 5 lines of poetry for knowing the Mu'tamad. When you have the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun have a dispute, when they have this, then it's this. When it's this, then it's that, right? So there's a whole layout of this this principle and methodology of when there's a difference.
So what happens after 885 AH?
885, the last of the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun die out. Now, as a side point, when people saw the level of knowledge that Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, who's the grandson of Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, because Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, he lived from 661 to 728. When Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, who was the big Shafi'i Mujtahid, when he saw him, he kissed him on the forehead and he said, "I thought I'd seen the last of your like." So they were rare in his time. They were starting to die out at that point. And everyone was shocked because he just came and kissed him on the forehead. He said, "I thought I'd seen the last of your like." And historians said that means the Mujtahid people were able to differentiate between what's rajih and what's not. That I saw it's in the last of you.
And what year did Imam Taqiyuddin pass away?
He died 728. So they were starting to thin out at that point. They were thinning out at that point. So there's him, there's Ibn al-Qayyim, right? So you have to remember the family that he's from. Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah is an absolute mujtahid. Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah, who's a relative of his who died 622, he's an absolute mujtahid within the madhhab, right? Then you have also his father, Shihabuddin Abdul Halim ibn Taymiyyah. He was a big faqih. That family is well established. So,
and in this era, Imam Ibn Abdul Hadi, he also include Ibn al-Mabrid.
Yes, Ibn al-Mabrid died 909. Now he's coming after that era.
Right.
And what he's doing is you have the Mujtahidun al-Mukharrijun, which are the Mujtahids of Derivation. They become prominent.
So this is what comes next.
Yes, they become prominent. Now they start to collect together the statements of the Murajjihun, the preferential Mujtahids, and what the preferential Mujtahids have completed, they discuss. And what they haven't completed, whatever doors are open, They start to have the majalis, the council meetings, to see about finishing off what they've done, right? And then what's still open, to discuss that. New issues have to be discussed. So now this period, you have to go through a period of expansion. So now there's all this expansion that's happening, all these commentaries, all these other things that are occurring. All these things start to happen because of the efforts that they're expending.
And what are the books that we're looking at, and who are the scholars authoring these books?
So at this point, I like to call it the 2 by 2 because all of these big elders were huge, but they each start to produce 2 standout scholars in every era. Okay, so we already had Muwafaquddin al-Qudama and Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, now we're going to have another 2 that stand out. Okay, the next 2 that stood out from all the others were 2 major figures. They are Imam Sharafuddin Abu al-Manja Musa ibn Ahmad al-Hajjawi. He dies 968 Hijri. Big Palestinian scholar. He writes Al-Iqna', which is the gathering together of the knowledge that had come before in a simplified fashion, about 4 volumes. He also has Zad al-Mustaqni'. So he summarizes the Zad, but what he does is he takes another kitab, al-Wajiz, which was written by the great alim ad-Dujaili, who died 732 Hijri. He takes al-Wajiz, combines al-Wajiz within the al-Muqni', then he shortens it down. So this led to Zad al-Mustaqni'. The next big figure at the same time was Imam Taqiyuddin al-Futuhi, who died 972. He creates a book called al-Muntaha. Now, al-Muntaha is built on top of Alauddin al-Mardawi's work on the Muqni' and his final book, at-Tanqih, which is the final work of Alauddin al-Mardawi, died 85 Hijri. So he builds the Muntaha on top of that. So it's al-Muntaha fi jami' bayn al-Muqni' wa al-Tanqih wa ziyadat. This is the full name of the word. The uttermost boundary in gathering between the Muqni', the Tanqih, and also additional matters. Those 2 together, the madhhab gathers upon those 2 commentators. So then they start creating commentary literature based upon those, because they explain all the literature before and how to get to the bottom of the Mu'tamid, closed door issues, open door issues, what's Mu'tamid in terms of what's missing, what needs to be fleshed out. If there are, because in every elder's statements, there might be ambiguous words that his students or contemporaries in his time didn't flesh out. And so there's a statement that's kind of general. Sometimes the Qutb, he gave this ruling here, but then his final ruling was something else before he died. And then you have to flesh all that stuff out.
Right.
So that's what they did. Now, are there questions on them before I talk about the next 2 collectors?
Well, there is actually. So when we talk about these major collections, Al-Iqna' and Al-Muntaha, now, do we look at them as, obviously these are the Mu'tamad books, but since they're larger books, do we look at them more as a reference? Because they also made mutun. They come up.
Yes, that's correct. These are mutun. Now, some people will tell you, some people will tell you that you should memorize al-Muntaha. Now, I don't know why they're telling you this. Not because it's bad, but that's 2 big, thick volumes.
Yes, it's large.
Now, if someone tells you, listen, that should be your foremost reference, that's true. Because now we have to understand the methodology of al-Hajjawi and al-Futuhi. When whatever al-Hajjawi and al-Futuhi say together, that's the Mu'tamid. If they differ, you go with al-Futuhi. So I understand why somebody would say you should study the Muntaha or just memorize it, right? Because more than one teacher I've heard say you should memorize it. I was like, what are they doing?
Whoa.
Because that's a big project,
right?
But if they said you should make that your foremost reference text,
right?
Now, people who are going to be fuqaha or qadis, yes, that you tell that too.
All right.
But I'm not sure if you should be saying that to the rank and file. I think you should say to the rank and file, you should have this in your collection so that you can, reference issues that you need to. I think that's the more, and I think that's most likely what they meant. I don't think that was a command to anybody studying the fiqh. Just go ahead and just memorize al-Muntaha, because it's a big undertaking. It's a big undertaking.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's a big undertaking, right? Now, is that the only question about those two before I go to the next collectors?
Yeah, so basically they are, especially for the high-ranking scholars, these are major reference books, right? It's not really for the laity and for those even students, let's say, as a main reference.
It's going to be something high level, but there's books that have been devised for the laity that we're going to talk about in a moment.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
So the next two collectors we have are none other than Imam Mar'i ibn Yusuf al-Karmi Zainuddin. He dies 1033, a Palestinian from Tulkarm, which is a hotspot of activity against Israel today, mashallah. And the other big collector is Imam Mansur ibn Yunus al-Buhuti, rahimahullah, from Bahwat in Egypt. He dies 1051 Hijri. They have one scholar that they share in common, which is Yahya ibn Musa al-Hajjawi, the son of Musa al-Hajjawi. They share him in common. Now, they both commentate upon the works of the elders just before them, the two collectors form al-Futuhi and al-Hajjawi. Now, here's what happens. Imam al-Karmi writes Ghayatul Muntaha, which is the commentary on al-Muntaha. Then, out of that, he does a mukhtasar of Ghayatul Muntaha. This mukhtasar is called Dalil al-Talib, which is a smaller metin for the common slaves of Allah and students. Imam Mansur al-Buhuti, rahimahullah, he writes a commentary on al-Iqna' called Kashaf al-Qina' an Matan al-Iqna', bringing it in line with the Mu'tamid. So where there's disputes, he'll say, oh, listen, the Mu'tamid's actually this. He then does a hashya on al-Muntaha. Then he writes a commentary on al-Muntaha called Daqa'iq ul-Nuha. Then after that, he writes a sharh on Zad al-Mustaqni' called al-Rawd al-Murbi'. Then he extracts out of al-Rawd al-Murbi' a final book called Umdat al-Talib, which is kind of his answer to Dalil al-Talib. Because you have to remember, they're students and they're also in friendly competition. So this is his last statement on fiqh, which in this case is Dalil al-Talib, which is Umdat al-Talib. Umdat al-Talib is, he was written 6 months before he died, and it's kind of like an answer to Dalil al-Talib.
Subhanallah.
And there's a commentary by Ibn Qa'id al-Najdi, rahimahullah, who died 1080, if memory serves me correct. He wrote a commentary on that called Hidayat al-Raghib, which is the commentary on Umdat al-Talib. And Imam Abdul Qadir al-Badran, who died 1346, rahimahullah wa Allah, he said that is his thing to use al-Umda fil fiqh by Muwaffiq al-Qudama as his reference kitab, and to do hifz of Umdat al-Talib.
Subhanallah. All right.
Oh. Although he studied other kutub, but that's his personal methodology.
And he's based in Sham.
Yes, he's based in Sham. Right. That was his personal methodology.
Right. Okay.
And he gives suggestions to students of knowledge in al-Madkhal. In his book al-Madkhal, he gives like suggestions to not just Hanbali students of fiqh, but he says if someone wants to study Maliki fiqh, because he spoke to different scholars, he said your methodology should be like this, 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 and this. So for the Hanbalis, he said your methodology should be this, but then he also gave like his own personal suggestions, right? So those two collectors, al-Buhuti and al-Karmi, when they differ, when they come together, that's the Mu'tamid. When they differ, it's al-Buhuti. Right? So that's what we look at. Now, after them, you had another two collectors, yeah.
Remarkable.
You had another two amazing collectors, yeah. They were Imam Hassan al-Shati, rahimahullah, who died 1274 Hijri, and the big elder, Mustafa ibn Abduh al-Ruhaybani al-Suyuti, who although was based in Ruhayba, is actually Egyptian by his lineage.
MashaAllah.
They came together and put together al-Buhuti as well as al-Karmi and numerous other writings and created Matalib ul-Nuha fi Sharhi Ghayat al-Muntaha. So there what they do is they've put together 30 other kutub as well as the statements of al-Buhuti and al-Karmi, sewn them together, fleshed them out, worked them through, and given new rulings and explanations on the matter.
SubhanAllah, MashaAllah.
So they're the most recent two major marja collectors, major figures.
And they also gathered the contemporary ijtihad issues, right?
That's correct. So in there is a discussion about Napoleon and what happened with Egypt and all these other things. So there's all these other rulings that have happened. So right now, the mutun for study, right, in general are Zad al-Mustaqni' that tends to be studied, and Dalil al-Talib, right, for very basic students. In some way, shape, or form, you're going to be looking at something like that as a base text. In some way, you'll either be Dalil al-Talib or Mukhtasar al-Dalil, also known as al-Ajwibat al-Jaliyah, or some form of that. If you study, or maybe you'd look at Al-Amal al-Salih by Imam Ahmad al-Shami, rahimahullah, which is basically just the Mukhtasar of Dalil al-Talib, right? Or you'd be looking at the Zad, but normally Ar-Rawd al-Murbi' is studied with it. So what's happened is a group of elders in Qatar came together and created a sharh on Ar-Rawd al-Murbi', as well as Hashia, another discussion around it. And so what's happened is Ar-Rawd al-Murbi' has kind of become a metin.
Right.
Because Zad al-Mustaqni is such a brief text. So what's happened is Ar-Rawd al-Murbi' has kind of become like a metin. Now Zad, I'd say the Zad is probably easier to memorize than Dalil al-Talib. Because the Zad actually rhymes. And it covers more masail as well. It has more masail that are covered. But the Dalil has advantages in which everything's delineated, where it will say, okay, the nullifiers of Salah are the following number. Number 1, this. Number 2, this. Number 3, right? So it's just, it only has maybe 6 or 7 areas where it'll say something like, for example, if you're in Salah and you lean against something with purposeful intent, that's a nullifier of Salah. That's not the Mu'tamid. That's a stricter position, but that's not the Mu'tamid, right? Whereas in the Zad, you're going to find fewer instances like that. But you will find some instances because Imam Musa al-Hajjawi was a mujtahid in his own right. And also, as we discussed, he took the Muqni' and the Wajiz and put them together. And then boiled them down and created the Zad al-Mustaqni'. So when Imam al-Buhuti rahimahullah comments upon it, he mentions these points and says, yes, this is from al-Wajiz. This is from this point, right? So what's happened is the mutun that people are studying now is the Dalil with Imam al-Taghlibi's notes. And Imam Taghlibi died 1133. So that's like being treated as a metin, although it's a hashia, is being treated as a metin now. Right. And then the Zad, the Zad al-Mustaqni', it's so the mutun are like Ar-Rawd al-Murbi' and Nail al-Ma'arib. Those are like the two mutun now. right? So
SubhanAllah.
that's what's happened. And so people are building on top of them. So there's all this hawashi and everything else being built. And that's where we find ourselves today.